think a few people might be struggling, and I know Lee and Dallas are here, but just wanted to give a brief introduction. So today we're very honored to have one of my mentors, Tom Bellin, here to present. And I think a lot of us have heard him talk about missing data. He's a renowned expert in the field. And today we're privileged that he'll be speaking on something sort of different. So the title was very engaging, recognizing trust and understanding as twin pillars of statistical ethics. So I'm very excited to welcome Tom, and I'll turn the floor over to him.
Thanks. Pivoting off that introduction, I guess I would note that life itself is a missing data problem, so that so you might think of this as missing data, but then also there's the ethics of talking about the same kind of thing over and over again versus mixing it up a little bit. So we were having the sidebar discussion about how I landed on the American Statistical Association Committee on Professional Ethics. I started officially January of last year, and so this is my second of a 3-year term, and I was these ASA committees, you can have as much as, hey, come on in. One thing about statistical ethics is that you can see friends / people who you owe certain things to, but I think I finally got back to Susan. So that's always an issue with me about communication. I would include that as part of the umbrella. So if you have sort of issues with ethics that you want to raise with me on any topic, it's fair game. But I was saying on these. So the American Statistical Association actually has this Committee on Professional Ethics, and its mandate is kind of broad and vague, like certain committees are. But and sometimes people come with questions about.
They have a website with a few things, right?
Oh yeah, no, it's a long established committee. I think that it has a history. I don't remember all the details on the history. Some of my colleagues on the committee are more knowledgeable about it. It goes back decades. And
I just want to say that I actually used their website to generate the discussion for my class this quarter, which was ethics. So that, I think it came out of that committee.
Yeah, there's been an effort to develop, I don't know if you were using case studies, or they have, which they developed out of.
3 of them on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's been an effort to enrich that. When I started on the committee, there was a set of guidelines that had been developed for many years and then went through committees for many years, and finally got approved by the ASA Board of Trustees in 1999. And there was this pervasive sense that the guidelines have to be updated, and the guidelines, when you look at them, and I'll allude to it here later in a bit, it's like 13 pages of text, which includes about half of it is like a preamble to explain why you're going. Well, by the time, with people's modern attention spans, people are just not, I mean, and you would go around and you ask people, are you aware of the ethical guidelines of the American Statistical Paradigm? I didn't know we had ethical guidelines and stuff. So obviously it hasn't been that successful an intervention, and this concept of trust and understanding was, for me, kind of like, well, if you're in a problem-solving mode, you want to try to have a system for dealing with concerns about ethics. And one strategy, which I think was embodied by the previous set of guidelines, was to have a list of all the scenarios where ethical issues arise, and then have a kind of a set of principles to govern this. Here are our principles governing reporting things accurately. These are our principles regarding, human subjects related concerns. These are our principles regarding, providing good value for as a service person. This kind of listing of a lot of domains. And I thought, this is hopeless. I mean, they want us, first of all, they want us to want to shorten this. What are you going to cut out of that? I mean, it just seems impossible. Second of all, it's like, nobody even is going to take the time to read the things that you have as well. So I thought, well, there's another framework, which is if you can come up with a kind of a simple test for any scenario, and how do the facts of this scenario align with your particular test, and that might provide some guidance. And that was where I got started on the idea, and it's interesting. It might be worth saying what's not in the pillar. Rob was saying how he thought the temples of Rome and Athens were built on more than 2 pillars, and you might think of things like truth and accuracy and so forth. But one of the realities, as I thought about some of my own experiences in statistics where ethical issues were involved, were that there were true statements that were misleading. And that actually is where I thought the ethics, and so that in some ways the truth or accuracy was encompassed under this broader framework of trust. And so that was a bit of how I got started on it. Let's see, so I'm using this guy. And I thought I'd give a couple of other examples from my experience that related to, that I thought would help fix ideas for discussion. One, the reference here to psychiatric annals. The original project actually was in the Division of Cancer Prevention and Control Research with Ellen Gritz. So there was a study of head and neck cancer patients where, and I just arrived at UCLA as a postdoc. And in the study, the data had been collected, something like 190 patients, and there were probably other reasons why, but it was a randomized study, and the goal was to get people to quit smoking. And you might think, how hard is that for head and neck cancer patients? They've got head and neck cancer, but it's so addictive. And so I can't remember what the control treatment was, something less intensive, and the active treatment was a full court press of admonishment by the doctors to stop smoking, have them sign a contract to stop smoking. And at the end of this multi-year data collection, multi-million-dollar study, the control group had a higher rate of smoking cessation than the treatment group. And I don't remember exactly how I was asked, but it was more or less, well, you're a statistician, can you fix this? and I was as baffled as anybody else by that. I mean, but you know, there are times in life where you figure that there's an active intervention that could be counterproductive. That's one possible explanation. But just as an instinct, I thought, well, there might be some factor that was out of balance in the randomization, and there also could have been out of balance partly from dropout in the study that I didn't. It turned out that there was a covariate called they labeled stage of change. Pre-contemplator, contemplator, action, or maintenance. Pre-contemplator is somebody who hasn't even thought about quitting smoking. Contemplator is somebody who's thought about it but hasn't done anything. Action is somebody who's started trying. Maintenance is somebody who's in the midst of it. And if you did a 2x4 chi-square test, treatment control by stage of change, there was a p-value of about 0.02, with the control group having more people who were further along in stage of change. When you adjusted for stage of change, it didn't make the treatment effect significant, but it reversed the sign and put it in the right direction. I was last seen riding atop a white horse into the sunset, and I'm still here 20-some years later.
Was there data on like folks who relapsed? Beyond maintenance, it's like the relapse thing?
There, I don't remember, but somehow there was actually a staff statistician. There's even more to this story. I'm going to not belabor it, but there was some sort of funny side. Like the funny sidelight was that I had asked the person, why don't you do a stepwise logistic regression, force in treatment and stuff, and a couple years later when I was talking about this example to a group of health services graduate students, out of 10 questions I got, either 9 out of 10 or all 10 were like, well, I thought you weren't supposed to do stepwise. Why did you do stepwise? What's the deal with stepwise? Stepwise. I was like, and I felt like I made a mistake. I should have done, the way I described it here was actually, would have been a better strategy of, before looking at any outcome data, look to see whether there's any lack of balance, and then, so that then I would have gotten to the same point without having to offend the sensibilities of the anti-stepwise league, the ASL. Anyway, those kinds of things came out of it. But there was another question then that came up that I thought had ethics-oriented implications. They asked, do we have to report the marginal result in our research paper? What would you say? See, it's a there's a dilemma, right?
Yeah.
There's a genuine dilemma. You don't want to, first of all, you don't want to embarrass your colleagues and your friends now already. I mean, and so you also, is it really necessary to? I took the position that yes, you have to report it. I mean, you had a publicly funded research project where this is what you said you were going to do, but you don't have to emphasize it. You can put in a table with the logistic regression results, and you can emphasize that. Well, they were happy with that, and that was kind of how it got published in a Cancer Epidemiology, Biomarkers and Prevention was the name of the journal. But that's any time when there's a clash of values, a dilemma, where the science of it doesn't really resolve it, then you have an ethics issue involved. I guess and I think that it's important maybe to characterize the reasoning that I had, and I'll map it back to the trust and understanding that if you allow people a free pass not to publish the embarrassing looking results, then you're going to end up with a system that isn't well calibrated. You should people can better understand what's going on, and I think that it turned. I think that the reality made it not so embarrassing anyway. I mean, it was a factor was out of balance. That kind of thing happens all the time. I mean, maybe they should have thought about that when they were doing the randomization. That's maybe for the next research. But then it helps when you're more open about these things. Then I think it helps the next researchers better anyway. So that's. Oh, now here's an ethical dilemma. This is my daughter calling, but she's homesick today. I'm going to take it though. Just say, Janet, honey. You know what? I'm in the middle of a talk on ethics, so I can't. I can't. Is it urgent? Is it urgent? Coming where? Oh, no. Oh, that's right. No, I don't think I'll be able to make it today, although I thought, well, maybe I will. Maybe I will later. Okay, thanks. Okay, bye-bye. Sorry about that. I thought, it could be an emergency.
Yeah, this is getting posted.
Yeah, I know. Well, what was I supposed to do? It was my daughter. She was homesick today. All right.
Was that a pre-specified outcome?
No, I know. I mean, life sometimes happens. That's
out of balance, until the glass moving.
But you anticipated my next point about pre-specification. So I already did that. So this is a little bit more elaborate, but and a little bit more statistical. I was reminded of this. This was also an early career thing. I used to review protocols for the Clinical Research Center, which was the predecessor of the CTSI now. It tended to be small projects, either pilot studies or sometimes based on sponsored research. There might be a multi-site study where UCLA's patients would be evaluated through this Clinical Research Center. And I'll show you so it had to do with this infection that is risky for infants with congenital heart disease. And there had been a previous study of this RSVIG. I can't remember what the IG stood for, immunoglobulin. I thought it was probably something like that. And I'll show you about this. In this previous study, there were 6 deaths, and they were all in the active treatment arms, but the Fisher exact p-value was 0.145. I'll show you the data on this. But this was, this was from a consent form that was attached to the protocol that had already been approved by the UCLA IRB. It said RSVIG is presently an investigational drug, and its use for prevention of RSV infection is being studied. In a multi-center study conducted from these years, it was found to significantly reduce the frequency and severity of lower respiratory tract infections, reduce the frequency of hospitalization due to RSV infection, and reduce the number of days in the intensive care unit in comparison to children who received no RSVIG. Here is some background from the application. An earlier trial of an intravenous application, I don't remember whether the current one was intravenous or not, enrolled children with bronchopulmonary dysplasia, prematurity, and cardiac disease. Monthly high-dose infusions were found to reduce frequency of lower respiratory infection in all high-risk infants by 62% as compared to the no-dose group, and to reduce the severity of the disease. RSV hospitalizations were also reduced. In that trial, however, 6 study children died. 5 children who died had congenital heart disease. On review, it was evident that these deaths were related to surgical complications. Well,
there's missing something.
This is sort of to your local statistician, this is missing something. It seems it sort of reverses the usual statistical paradigm of we're not going to make assumptions that we know what the mechanisms are of these outcomes. We're going to view whatever the treatments are as something of a black box ensemble of elements, and even the blinding or non-blinding of an intervention could be part of the treatment protocol. And so the same salient actions under blinded versus unblinded conditions are technically different treatments. And so you could think, it's hard to know. Like, well, I mean, where did that last statement come from? And by the way, I mean, going back to the consent form, where are the deaths here? I mean, if you're a parent approving your kid for the study.
This next page isn't on the consent form?
No, the consent form, this was just, no.
That's it.
That was the consent form. This was from the background that I'm reviewing for approval within the Clinical Research Center, although the consent form has already been through the IRB, and I in the context of this episode, I called the head of the Human Subject Protection Committee, and I asked him about it. He said, I remember that proposal. He said, I remember there were some questions that we had, and investigators answered the questions, and then I guess we approved it after they got back to us with their answers. So that's part of the context. So then there's also a multi-site proposal from the pharma company that was attached to this whole enterprise. It said 6 study children died during the period from the first infusion to 4 months after the last infusion. 3 of the 81 in the high-dose group, 3 of the 79 in the low-dose group, and none of the 89 in the no-dose group. P equals 0.15. So I was like, well, I can do a Fisher exact test just like my colleague, Dr. Weiss, so I did. so one thing that I think was interesting was that I would call this P equals 0.15, but I thought, well, no, that's interesting when it's like at a restaurant. How often do the rounding errors go in your favor, and how often do they go in the restaurant's favor, right? So this is a rounding error. They're rounding up the 0.145 to 0.15 as a p-value. It's accurate, but if you did collapse the low dose and high dose, well, it's still not quite significant at conventional levels. But 0.068 one tail, but well, there's a tradition of doing two-tailed I mean, it's sort of like, well, what's the standard here? And there was also something in the proposal, I'll breeze past it, but I mean, I have the actual language with me, about they hired an independent consultant to review each death, with the consultant concluding that there was no clear mechanism through which the active treatment would induce the death. And I mentioned this call. it turned out that this so-called independent consultant was also a co-investigator on the current proposal. And so I
What year was this?
this was like 93 or something like that. So it's been a while. Let me actually, I'm going to read, there was this question that I had, what would you do as you're thinking about it? So one thing that I did, by the way, was I kept all my documentation. I kept all the paperwork on this because I thought, I don't know.
That's why he uses my office for storage.
Dear Chair of the Clinical Research Center, I do not approve of this protocol as it is written because I strongly believe that the consent form should be modified based on the finding of higher number of deaths in the HSV-IgIV groups in the earlier study than in the control group. Although I am personally prepared to accept a determination that the deaths occurred due to unrelated causes, I do not think it's accurate to characterize parental consent as, quote, informed, when only the positive findings from the earlier study are offered to parents without mentioning that there was a higher death rate in the HSV-IgIV groups that doctors regard as likely or at least plausibly due to chance. I'm not saying that the research should not go forward under any conditions. Rather, I'm saying that the research should not go forward without a more appropriate consent notification. Sincerely yours, and then I signed it with a...
Where was it? Was it in the FDA approval process? Was it like a phase 3 or phase 4?
No, this was well, I don't know exactly. Well, actually, I might actually. I'd have to delve. I have it all here. What I had from the study, but the my guess is this was probably more like phase 2. I mean, the Clinical Research Center and the CTSI, to some extent, are set up as umbrellas so that you don't have to have an enterprise like UCLA send all of its studies for consideration to Washington for review, you know, if it's a part of a multi-site study or pilot study. I mean, so you want to decentralize certain decisions, but I felt like I was taking my role seriously. Now, what I'm going to tell you next is that what happened, I have all these fractal stories. Several months later, I was doing some other work in the Clinical Research Center. I saw one of the nurses who I knew was involved with CRC work. I said, well, by the way, whatever happened with that proposal? I never heard anything about it. Oh, it got approved. We enrolled patients on it. Now, thank God for all of us, I think that none of the UCLA patients died. I mean, because if my letter had been in there and a patient had died and that gets discovered, and in addition to not being good for the enterprise, it probably wouldn't have been good for me personally. I mean, those kinds of things, when you play a whistleblower type role, you have to be prepared to accept certain consequences that can come down the pike from your actions. And in fact, so what would you do at that point? What would be your thought? One possibility is just grin and bear it, pout. Doesn't sound like me though, does it? So what would be? What are some of the alternatives? What could
You're
be?
still here.
I'm still here, so it it didn't run me out of town.
Yeah.
But
So you contact the big boss, or you contact the PI, somebody on the research team at least?
yeah, it's an interesting question. Like you start having to game out things like that, and there frankly could be legal consequences. Like if you contacted NIH or something like that on something like that, you might have some justification for doing that, but you also would, once it's in their pipeline, it takes on a life of its own, you know that. So what I ended up doing was...
So it's interesting that you weren't informed, because I would think that, as a reviewer, and, in response to your letter, at least they should have, it's like beyond ethics, it's like a common courtesy to let you know what the outcome was.
Well, one thing I've noticed in life generally and in research specifically, and in this episode in particular, is that errors are seldom independent. There's a positive correlation between, so there were multiple phenomena going on here. They glossed over the usual model of how we don't pretend to know all the mechanisms that can give rise to death. They used the they hired a consultant, but he turned out to be a co-investigator. They rounded up the p-value. You know, there are all these things. Individually, they don't necessarily add up to, you know, very much. Collectively, they don't. They stink, right? And so, what I ended up doing is you know, at the time, Bob Elishoff was my mentor. The dates on this, by the way, the letter was November 24, 1993. So I started as an assistant professor July 1, 93. And then it's April 25, 1994, notes for GCRC Advisory Committee. So basically what I did is I went to Elishoff, who was on this advisory committee for the CRC. I said, this is not acceptable. I partly was, you know, and I think that there's a need to align. For me, a successful system is one where the incentives are aligned properly. And I felt like that just taking it doesn't align any incentives. So what I felt like needed, and one of the big problems was that my letter was disrespected. That's actually an issue that statisticians have, I think, collectively. And so I felt like what would prevent this kind of thing in the future and elevate my status at the same time? It would be calling for an agenda item at an upcoming General Clinical Research Center meeting. I came with a handout that looks like this that had highlighted things from the different protocols and the different parts of it that I wanted to call attention to, highlighted from there. I think I had a SAS output of you know, the Fisher exact test results. And, you know, there were people who I regarded as friends who weren't real comfortable in that meeting because they realized that they hadn't paid as close attention to my letter as they should have, as in a sense I'm laying down the gauntlet here. You have to pay attention next time I write something like this. And that ended up, it was a bit of a, it was, you know, and that was how it ended. I felt like I had addressed the issue. Fortunately, nobody had been hurt. I don't know, do you think that was enough?
I have a parallel story,
Yeah.
which I'll try to not be fractal about, which is also involves one of the people you've mentioned, relative.
Mm-hmm.
There's a, which is the, and I wish I don't have very good details because it's hazy memory, but there's something out on the market for, like, that'll take your cold and make it last.
Less long.
Zycam.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the what's it? It's zinc. Yeah, zinc.
And supposedly, on the Zycam side of that, whatever study was used to prove it, there were more deaths than on the non-Zycam side. And if you throw the deaths in there in terms of, like, the number of days gained for not having colds is kind of easily counterbalanced by the extra deaths.
Well, by the way, I was worried about that, and this said, like, oh, the hospital length.
I read the Cochrane meta-analysis on this. Yeah, because I was obsessed with mortality after the SSRI stuff came out. And actually it does, over all of the studies, it shortens the length of a cold by 3 hours.
And Zycam is like a hugely...
But they've done studies and they pulled all the analyses all over the world with the, you know, with the generic and whatever, right? And it shortens it by like 3 hours.
And how about deaths?
You know, the mortality was not increased from what I had seen, but it's been a couple years.
But the deaths weren't significant even supposedly in the stuff that went through FDA.
Yeah, well, you know, those things don't have to go through FDA.
Because it's not a.
So yeah, because they're over they're food dietary supplements. In fact, they cannot make legally they cannot make a claim that they cure what they call a medical illness. So it's
basically all this coldies and like airborne and Zycam stuff, they don't work.
No, they don't.
I don't know. It's like,
I won't do
yeah,
it all
no,
the time.
well, it's
I have a
tricky.
whole
These are
lecture.
tricky. I mean, like, I was like, really? I use coldies. It actually seems to help my colds. I mean, so the
Well, I have a whole other thing about that.
interesting. I'll be interested to know. The could be a placebo effect for all I know.
I'm going for it.
Is that right? So this one of my perspectives, something that came back to me when and I have, by the way, this essay, so that I started out mentioning I'm on this American Statistical Association Committee on Professional Ethics, and through that I have been trying to push a particular framework for updating our professional society guidelines on statistics. And this essay, I thought, first I tried to float it with the whole committee to see if everybody would get behind, and they were like, no, it's too much for them. So then I was like, okay, well, let me organize a session at an upcoming, so we have an invited session at the upcoming joint statistical meetings that I'm one of the speakers, and then there's some other perspectives, and then I set it up so that they would post the essays that we each write, so that my essay will then get posted on the website for the committee. So I was thinking, like, it becomes like a dissemination of the ideas, and I tried to rally other people around it. It was too much for them, so I figured out another way to get my message through in that one. But part of what had triggered this was with Don Rubin being my advisor, and I remembered this book chapter that had interested me. It was kind of an obscure, not one of his main publications, and the context actually is model-based versus design-based inference in survey settings. And Rubin at the time, this is early 80s, is identifying as a Bayesian statistician, and he makes a statement that was more tailored for the philosophical debate between Bayesian and frequentist statisticians, trying to motivate why he was doing what he was doing. And the idea was that, well, people tend to naturally interpret confidence intervals with a Bayesian interpretation of this is the probability that the interval covers the true value, rather than the frequentist interpretation of if you repeatedly did these procedures 95% of the time, an interval constructed this way would cover the true value. Very subtle difference to most people. In a lot of problems, it doesn't have any practical impact because the Bayesian and frequentist intervals align in a lot of simple problems. But anyway, he said something that connected with, he has a background also in psychology. He said, statisticians have an obligation to provide the kinds of answers clients will assume are being provided. And it I thought, captured a broader principle and issue and tie-in with, for me, statistics is something of the foreign language of the sciences that encodes a lot of, when you say p less than 0.05, it's code for a whole layering of logic. We assumed this, we compared this, we found the probability of this given that is less than 0.05, therefore our inference is this. I mean, so it's a shorthand way of communicating a lot of information. And I think of who we are and what we do is fundamentally trying to translate evidence from data into conclusions and decisions and actions that people might reasonably want to take or not take. And our discreteness as individuals and our need to communicate induces certain imperatives, in my view of life, the universe, and everything. That, what did I say here? Where am I heading with this? So I talk about various interests that statisticians have in ethics. That wasn't really, here's something about these guidelines. I feel like I'm, let me see if I can sort of pick up on some place where the trail of thought. So this existing guidelines that were like 13 pages of text had, they were intended to help practitioners make and communicate ethical decisions. Has sections on professionalism, responsibilities to funders, clients, employers, responsibilities in publications and testimony, responsibilities, research subjects, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, when before we were talking, Scott and I were having a sidebar, and he was saying, some people think that statisticians should be sort of kind of out of the ethics business, and that's really something more for the, for the investigators, the clients. And I brought some notes from an earlier talk that I'd given from Deming, W. Edwards Deming, who's a towering figure in the statistics profession, who is known for continuous quality improvement. You guys knew of him through NIWA's advancement. There's a Deming lecture every year at the statistics meetings. He tended to be aligned very much with a frequentist perspective on statistics and a design-based rather than model-based inference perspective. He had this lecture that he gave that got translated into an article called Principles of Professional Statistical Practice in 1965 in the Annals of Mathematical Statistics. And in alluding, for example, to a statistician as an expert witness, he said, his career as an expert witness will shatter and shipwreck if he indicates concern over which side of the case the results seem to favor. Quote, as a statistician, I couldn't care less, end quote, is the right attitude in a legal case or in any other report. He says, in my opinion, the statistician should not recommend to the client that he take any specific administrative action or policy. Use of the results that come from a survey or experiment are entirely up to the client. The statistician, if he were to make recommendations for decision, would cease to be a statistician. What did he say here on inference? The frame for a comparison of two medical treatments might be patients or other people in Chicago with a specific ailment. A pathologist might, on his own judgment, without further studies, generalize the results to people who have this ailment anywhere in the world. Statistical theory provides no basis for such generalizations. True enough. Now, I remember one time in a class on causal inference saying to the class, now if we had a case series of patients in Chicago on a headache medication, and the question was, would you consider using the headache medication for yourself? What would be your reaction? Would you tend to use the results from the study in Chicago, or would you tend to disregard the results? And one of the students' hands shot up, and I called on him, and he said, I absolutely would not use the results from Chicago. And I was like, darn it, that was not the message. I was trying to convey the message that, yes, of course, we do that kind of thing all the time. We make exchangeability assumptions with other people. But it was interesting. He said, because I'm Korean, and it's well known that Asians and Caucasians tend to metabolize substances differently, and so the case series from Chicago is probably disproportionately Caucasian, so I don't necessarily believe it has anything to do with me. Well, so that's kind of the, laissez-faire, freedom of information perspective would say, yeah, that's possible for, the same set of data that for one person with a certain set of exchangeability assumptions, modeling assumptions, loss functions, make one decision, and another person, me, make a different decision from the same set of data. And I think that's fine in the world if that's the way the world works. I mean, I might actually want to try to convince him otherwise, maybe, or maybe not. I mean, maybe just, but those are the kinds of judgments that I think we end up making all the time, whether we just have to. It's just part of life, making those kinds of judgment calls. Let me keep going with what I had written here and see where it leads. comments on existing guidelines. Strengths include this identifying stakeholders who are deserving of respect and good faith from statistician, and identifying numerous contexts in which ethical considerations are central. Criticisms, length of the guidelines, impossibility of enumerating all the relevant contexts, lack of awareness of their existence. This last one, I have a whole other story, and I might, well, maybe I'll tell this one too. The risk of inducing vulnerability to manipulation by predatory operatives who play by different rules. This one came up, okay, I have it right here, okay. Expert witness example. I've only been twice hired as an expert witness and only once deposed. It was this time. The case was an allegation of Medicare fraud, whereby it was a psychiatric facility, and the claim by one of the workers was that the facility was artificially inflating the lengths of stay. And the data I got were an Excel spread. I got referred by somebody who was an expert psychiatrist witness who I never met on it, but had a UCLA affiliation. And the question was, is the average length of stay during the period of alleged fraud different from the average length of stay outside? And they had a number of patients before, a number of patients during, and a number of patients after. I did a highly sophisticated analysis, a one-way analysis of variance supplemented by all pairwise comparisons using Bonferroni, Tukey, and Chaffee, multiple comparison procedures that all showed that there was a significant difference across the groups, and then the difference between the before and the during and the after and the during were significant, and there was no significant difference between the before and the after. And then after I submitted a report, the lawyer who retained me reported that there were errors in the original spreadsheet and gave me another spreadsheet to analyze, and so I redid the report. Now then I was cross-examined by a lawyer for the healthcare facility. Now, Dr. Bellin, did you undertake any investigation into the accuracy and validity of the data you analyzed? No, sir, I didn't. Well, now, Dr. Bellin, don't you think you had an ethical obligation to determine the accuracy and validity of the data you analyzed? What would you say? I said, Ruth, you said no, why not?
Or how?
What?
Yeah, that's the
How?
question now.
How do you have it, what?
How do you investigate?
Yeah, well, fortunately, we're in good company here of people who don't fall into traps. I said absolutely not, because and my reasoning was that I wasn't asked to do so. I was only asked to provide my best professional judgment about whether the mean of one set of numbers was significantly different from another. If I'd been given a different set of numbers, I would have done a different analysis. I was charging a premium rate for my time. It would have been unethical to charge them for something they didn't ask me to do at a more expensive rate. So. But the trap is that usually in our scientific research teams, the statistician is playing the role often of knitting the results together and synthesizing conclusions that align with the. What are some comments that I have? Ability to replicate findings is a core element of science. Lawyers are known to lay traps. Of course, in the context of scientific research for publication, you do have an ethical obligation to make sure that what you're analyzing is accurate. I often refer to this, this was from a popularizing book on artificial intelligence, draw distinctions where there are important distinctions to be drawn. I also, this John Rawls' theory of justice, this is a concept that has influenced me, is a political science perspective on justice conceptualized from a game theory perspective. Economists had gotten involved in this game. It's like that when we were freshmen in college, we had this thing like if we ordered pizza at midnight, the deal was you divide, I choose. You know, so if you divide the pizza, then I get to choose first. Then the incentive for the divider is to make it as equal as possible, because then the divider gets an equal share. So, economists and game theory perspectives have this. But so Rawls takes the pizza problem and extends it to life, the universe, and everything, and conceptualized justice as a game where we're devising rules and nobody knows where the labels are on which people beforehand. I think that part of what I like so much about that, and to tie in back with the Rubin perspective, is that it requires a certain amount of empathy. You have to think about, how would I feel if I were in the other person's shoes? I mean, and so it's also conceptualizing the control of information as a form of power and a form of a possible tool for manipulation. And so I don't know. I think I'm going to wind up this framework built on trust and understanding. To me, the understanding part of it is that we're in the business as statisticians of enhancing or adding to knowledge, strengthening our knowledge base, expanding our knowledge base, and that trust becomes, and I have some extended quotes in that essay. There's an essay, if you haven't picked it up, that I tied in. I think I mentioned that. I tie in with a lot of these broad, these perspectives by some great philosophers over the ages. Spinoza, who ties in these empathetic ethics as sort of part of who we are as social animals, as humans, that if we don't consider others, then we're ultimately going to hurt ourselves. Hume had this perspective that we're bound to recognize conjunctions of events, but since you can't directly perceive the source of connection, you have to somehow reason about the sources of connection, and that's part of actually what we're trying, when we're doing causal inference, we're trying to make sense of what the connections are between, events that are joined by conjunctions. This part about trust, I'll be candid about it. I had my feelings hurt years ago by someone who lied to me. I ended up reading this series of books. It turned out the first one by Cicely Bach was the daughter of two Nobel Prize winners, Gunnar and, what was his wife's name? What's that?
Derek Bach.
She's the wife of Derek Bach.
Okay.
But she's the daughter of Gunnar Myrdal and what was the wife's name? They won Nobel Peace Prizes for for disarmament-oriented things, I think. But anyway, she wrote. Her contributions, I think, were more interesting than her husband's. The first book was called Lying. The second one was called Secrets, and the third was called A Strategy for Peace. And they actually align. But lying and secrets are like she's a philosopher, ethicist, and she says about lying, I believe that we must at the very least accept it as an initial premise, Aristotle's view that lying is mean and culpable and that truthful statements are preferable to lies in the absence of special considerations. She says that, I would like to refer to the principle of veracity as an expression of this initial imbalance in our weighting of truthfulness and lying. It's not necessarily a principle that overrides all others. She gives examples like, if somebody's stalking another person and comes to you and says, where is so-and-so, and you're not ethically obligated to tell the truth in a situation like that. Lying would be allowable, most people would agree. But she said, nor sufficient by itself witness the brutal but honest regime of the tormentor who prides himself on his frankness. Rather, trust in some degree of veracity functions as a foundation of relations among human beings. When this trust shatters or wears away, institutions collapse. So I guess I was in one of the sort of the hypothetical cases that I put in that essay. It was something that grew out of an anecdote that a person shared at one of our meetings, where she was just trying to come up with an assessment of damages in a situation where there were a few hundred, there were thousands of people who were damaged. It was too expensive to get information on everyone, so they took a random sample of a few hundred people, and her proposal was to take the average plus or minus 1.96 standard errors and to let that be the basis for an interval estimate of what the average damages were. I mean, nothing could be simpler from a statistical perspective, but the expert witness hired by the other side said, correctly, there might be a factor, a lurking variable that's associated with damages that wasn't collected in the data set. True statement. Therefore, here's the sleight of hand. There's no basis for using this procedure as a basis for estimating damages, but not offering anything else in its place. You know, so then it becomes, to me, it doesn't break down because it's not truthful. It breaks down because it fails the kind of the consistency, the hypocrisy test if he uses the same procedure in his own work somewhere else. And you could, you know, force people to fight on these things. It might be hard to actually document his using the procedure in some other thing. Well, how about in the textbook that he wrote? Those, you know, you could get into wars over those kinds of questions, but it just strikes me that maybe ethics is the way to resolve some of these things and to deal with the sort of the more predatory, less nice human tendencies, more competitive tendencies. Maybe I'll stop there. I've been doing most of the talking and let you guys, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, anecdotes of your own.
Questions? Anybody?
This is kind of a comment that ties into all this too, thinking about big data. You know, and people analyze these big data sets now, and there's all these correlations that come out of it, and people try to make causal inference out of that, forgetting that, you know, just because you have a lot of data, you still face the same statistical challenges.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because this past year, the invited session organized by a member of the ethics committee was on ethics as it relates to big data. And I would agree, first of all, with your framing of it, that just because you have large data sets, so there are still sort of modeling issues, but there are some really interesting other anecdotes that came out. As one was, there was a fellow who was a law professor who made a comment about 87% of the people in the United States are uniquely identifiable based on gender, birth date, and zip code. So with large databases, if they were publicly available, you could very easily, you might not be able to match everyone, but you might be able to match lots of people and then tie it in with the other things that you know about people, and there would be privacy issues. There was a business school professor who had a really interesting perspective on this. She talked about, like, by analogy with the mortgage debacle in the U.S. economy in 2008, that if you think of product cycles and the incentive structure, that what started to happen in that context was that the middlemen were making huge fees off of bundling individual mortgages into larger entities. And so it created this incentive on the front end to generate mortgages, and that you can end up with ethical problems when the suppliers on the front end also have a role in the system at the back end, like they're the consumers, but they're also the suppliers. And her thought in those kinds of situations is that for systems to work where you often need to intervene is through regulation or ethics kinds of interventions at the middleman level, because that's the portion of it where you have the best control because you have the fewest numbers of players. So that would be like regulate Wall Street. Well, similar issue though with any database. the downstream consumers, us, are also the suppliers. We're also on the front end, and it just sort of, like, when you start thinking of that front end stuff as creating a supply chain that's ripe for ethical abuses, that's a problem. Then there was the other one that was just unbelievable. If you know Dick DeVoe, who teaches at Williams College, gave an example from I think it was iCupid. It was a dating website, and they were wanting to validate their own procedures for judging, like the percent of compatibility between people, and they usually had people being compatible if they matched on whatever 70% of the characteristics or something like that, or 80, probably, I can't remember. But they took some people who were only 30% compatible, according to
the Wall Street Journal.
What?
It was in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, and then they told them that whatever the same sort of thing that they would tell them if they were 70 or 80% compatible, and then they validated it by comparing the chats and other, downstream phenomena. Well, not surprisingly, it did have some validity to it, but also it was completely unethical. I mean, to experiment on people let's say they probably had in their boilerplate language for people signing up, there probably was some legalese in there that they could use to cover their behinds, but that sometimes doesn't really work as a defense if it's not deemed reasonable to expect, most of your clients to go through and like a lawyer parse the fine print, so to speak. So anyway, there are a lot of issues that just I think you're right, by virtue of the sizes of the data sets.
Well, thanks, Tom, for your talk, and it's very impressive that you retained all your from the 90s, and it makes clear sense the state of your office.
That's right. It creates occupational hazards, doesn't it?
I had a quick
Yeah.
comment, and I was wondering if you could comment on kind of along the lines of disseminating our research findings in terms of publishing our data and publishing our research results. And these journals, the current system in place, it's up to the editor, and then a lot of the ad hoc reviewers are providing service in terms of volunteering their time. And oftentimes when I read papers that are published, a lot of them, there's some flaws, and it's published. And on the flip side to that, there are papers that are not published, and and then I think the current system in place, if you see some errors or things like that, there's mechanism in place where you can write to the editor, and then you can correspond to the authors and things like that. But I think the other side is a lot of the research findings are not disseminated because even if the ad hoc reviewers say publish, the editor has the executive decision to reject or accept based on the journal priorities, and so I was wondering, in terms of ethics, disseminating your research findings, like what's your thoughts on that?
I think that it's a great question. I think that there are a number of layers of issues that involve dilemmas that we want information to get out there, but we all have a limited attention span, so there's some need for balance there. I think that I'm reminded, I think it was Winston Churchill's democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So there's a certain element of we have to have some system in place, and so but I have a very statistical, a statistician's perspective, which is, nobody's perfect, nothing's perfect, it can always be better. And I think that in my own experience, I have certainly had, one of the examples, if I plow ahead, was here. Other examples. One of them that I was so upset about that Rob actually alerted me to as a colleague. I had done work to produce multiply imputed data sets on a project where it was the only time in my career that I'd had a written agreement to be a co-author for any publication that relied on my results, was the language of it, that I just signed the way it was written. And then they ended up publishing it and giving me an acknowledgement. But it was actually, they went to Rob to work with him on a follow-up project while it was still under review. So I found out while it was under review, and I'd asked for, by the way, if you have a copy of the manuscript, I'd be happy to look at it. They'd called me to ask for a reference and stuff. And I was just, so there are so many layers of this whole publication, and it takes on, it affects people's lives in the downstream sense of the research results, but it also affects the careers of the livelihoods of people. Yeah, Bon, did you have a comment?
Yeah, this is an off-topic question, but I've run into this a couple times now. I was working with somebody who, actually I have a friend and I know a colleague who is involved with companies that now do design adaptive research projects. And what was really interesting from both parties was the fact that they said that the code and the particular approach for the adaptive, the sort of estimating the potential range of, sample sizes depending on where you are in the outcomes, pre-specified that they could do it for us, but they can't show us how they did it. And
it was like a proprietary
thing. It was proprietary. It was a little bit of a black box. And the response I got from 3 different companies was, well, it would take us, 10 years to 5 years to train somebody who was like a top-level PhD graduate of a biostatistics program. And, even if we wanted to train him, we couldn't, in 6 months. Right? And
right.
So I guess, and I know this is increasingly being used, and I was just thinking, do journals go for this? And do grant review committees? And how do you replicate things if you don't know how they do this?
That's a really interesting question. I was going to, but the one
Anyway,
it does relate. It relates to the other. I think partly because of the open access journal movement is changing some of the dynamics and incentive structure of the whole publication setting. But I think that there might yet always be a sort of a pecking order of journals and prestige and stuff. Back to that example. I think if I'm familiar with it, if it relates to the Berry Associates, the Don Berry.
Yeah,
and that.
Exactly.
So I actually, based on my understanding of that methodology,
there are a couple companies out there
that are doing that,
yeah.
I think that I can understand the desire to have those methods remain proprietary and to have some patentable strategies or approaches, because to invest in developing that capability would be a substantial investment.
Like Bikram yoga,
Yeah, but I think that sometimes time has a way of working these kinds of things out. At UCLA, the whole development, as I understand the history of it, of the Department of Biomathematics, the medical school, was for BMDP. It was later called the Biomedical Data Program. There was a perceived need for developing, and there was a federal grant that they had to develop this, and then after a period of time, the federal government was like, well, SAS is now doing this as a private company on the open market. Why are we giving grant funding for this? And the grant funding stopped, but the software company got spun off of whatever was happening at UCLA and later got bought by SPSS and stuff. But anyway, my guess is that there will be a time when these adaptive design things, just like with one of the main software packages now in statistics is R, but it's open source. That's a complete knockoff on a previous framework called S+, or that was pivoted off of S, which was a matrix-based language that was developed that, people, they licensed to people, and then finally there were enough people, sort of a critical mass of independent researchers storming the barricades, so to speak, and taking it over for in an open source world. So I think that the ethics of those kinds of things is complicated. I'm not quite sure how to. I mean, I'd have to give that some thought. I think those are hard questions. At the same time, I think that there's some rationale, but I do think you raise a good point about the replicability of findings. That it becomes imperative for them maybe to provide a vehicle for people to.
I mean, it's actually,
replicate.
I think it's a big deal because, Corey's really into this, all the big data. The FDA has given out, major grants to like Roger Lewis to sort of figure out how to, do this with clinical trials. And, I literally talked to 3 different companies, not just Berry Associates, but another 2 companies who do this for drug companies all the time. And they say they won't, if they participate in a proposal, or they won't tell you how they develop the approach to pre-specify all the outcomes. I mean, they have some language which I guess is convincing for reviewers or statisticians.
Well, there's a book that's co-authored by some of the key people there that does talk about. No, that's. I mean, I think that's hard. I think it's a tricky question because are you knowledgeable about that or no?
No, but I was just thinking because I mean, if you're not doing a Bayesian analysis at the end, but if you were a frequentist, you need to know that whole mechanism, or you can't calculate a p-value. Just given the one train of things that how it actually was allocated, you can calculate a Bayesian posterior at the end, but you can't calculate a p-value, which is what
right. But if
95% of the people in the world are going to demand.
Well, but suppose they made an executable file that you couldn't see the code, but you could run it.
Well, then at least you can. That
Then,
sort of gives you that is the algorithm in a sense. It gives you a whole map of here's how the study could have gone.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it actually. I'll close with this because I think we've gone. Well, yeah. But
anyway,
there's a one of my favorite stories that leads to the principle that the best mathematical tables or statistical tables have errors in them. Now, why would that possibly be? Well, it turns out that with some of the tables that were developed with a lot of computational effort, that back in the day, then people would just sometimes copy the tables, and so there was an intellectual property interest. So how do you protect your intellectual property interest when what you're doing is providing something that's a mathematical result? Well, what some clever people did, I don't know a reference for this. It's a story that Don Rubin told me that I think Cochrane told him, is that you might, in like key places in the table, specified places, in the 4th decimal place, you put errors in there. Instead of instead of 0.3692, it becomes 0.3697. And then when you cross-examine the person, well, how did you do this? Well, I used such and such an algorithm. Oh, really? If you use such and such an algorithm, then why are there errors in exactly the same places that we intentionally put the errors? A very clever kind of counterintelligence,
Doesn't Google Maps do that too? Don't the mapping things do that?
It wouldn't surprise me if they do. I mean, it's a great concept and a great principle, but
well, these are major drug trials that are that are going through FDA approval process.
Yeah. Sometimes, I guess my point is that sometimes the issues are not binary, even though they might seem to be.
Okay, got it.
That there might be a way that they could provide something that doesn't reveal their secret, that still is useful. That's why the table idea popped in my mind. Yeah.
Okay, well, I just wanted to know how a statistician felt.
But I don't know the context that well, so I'm not sure that it's all, that if I looked at it, I might have some exact same concerns. So. All right, thanks everyone. Appreciate it so much.